Hello, this is the luckiest maths teacher in the world. Thank you so much for tuning into this video on the cosine rule. So like the sine rule, we use the cosine rule to find an unknown side or an unknown angle in a non-right angled triangle. Before we actually get to what the cosine rule is and to using it, I wanted to contrast this with the sine rule. Because when you're doing an exercise on the sine rule, it's easy. You know, all the questions in that exercise relate to the sine rule. When you do an exercise on the cosine rule, you know all the questions relate to the cosine rule. But it's important that you're able to see which rule do I use when. They're complementary, so you can use one when you can't use the other and vice versa. So the table here tells you when you use the cosine rule. Unlike the sine rule, we use it to find a side when we know two other sides and the angle between, and we can use the cosine rule to find an angle when I know the length of all three sides. So in these situations, I couldn't use the sine rule, but I could use the cosine rule. So let's go ahead and look at what the cosine rule actually is. So this is the equation for using the cosine rule to find a side. C squared equals a squared plus b squared minus 2ab cos c. So it's kind of like Pythagoras, but then there's a little bit more that you have to subtract. So just as when we were using the sine rule, small a, b, and c refers to sides, large letters refer to angles, and angle A must be opposite side A, angle B opposite side B, and so on. Let's look at an example of finding a side using the cosine rule. So we'll use the cosine rule to find the value of x in this triangle here. Just before I do that, I want to point out, if I wanted to find x using the sine rule, I couldn't. I would need to know this angle or this angle in order to use the sine rule. So lucky I have the cosine rule. So the cosine rule says that x squared, so x is like our c, it doesn't matter whether I call this c, x, whatever, so that will be equal to a squared plus b squared minus 2 times a times b times cos c, and of course c is 100. So if I put this on my calculator, again making sure my calculator is in degrees mode, I get about 411.567. So I'm just writing that. I don't want to round it on my calculator. I want to take that on my calculator and just hit the square root button, because that's the value of x squared. So x is just the square root of that, which is about 20.29. So there we have found the length of a side using the cosine rule. Now, this is sort of in keeping with what I was saying in the previous video. The largest side is always opposite the largest angle, and the shortest side is always opposite the smallest angle. So of course 100 would be the largest angle in the triangle, because you can't have more than one obtuse angle in a triangle, and x was the longest side. It's longer than the other two sides of 16 or 10. So we know we've done something right. So let's now look at using the cosine rule to find an angle. Please pause and copy this down if you need. So on your screen is the equation as to how to find a side using the cosine rule. If I want to find an angle, let's say I want to find angle C this time, I can just rearrange this equation. So firstly, I'm going to subtract a squared and b squared, and that leaves me with this. Okay, so because I have a negative here, I can times each side by -1. So that will become a squared plus b squared minus c squared equals 2ab cos c. Okay, it just gets rid of a negative because we all don't like dealing with negatives. So now I'm going to divide each side by 2ab. I just want to get rid of this part, so I'm left with cos c. So what I do to one side, I must do to the other. I get a squared plus b squared minus c squared over 2ab is equal to cos of c. So to get c by itself, I just take the cos inverse of both sides. So c equals cos inverse of a squared plus b squared minus c squared over 2ab. That is the formula for finding an angle using the cosine rule. So note, whichever angle you want, its side is the one that is subtracted and doesn't appear on the bottom. So this is the equation I will use on the next slide to find an angle using the cosine rule. So let's say I want to find x here. So again, doesn't matter whether I call it c or x. So because x is here, it's opposite the 88 side. 88 is the side that gets minused and the one that doesn't appear on the bottom. So it'll be cos inverse of the other side squared plus the other side squared. And as I said, 88 is the side that gets minused. And then on the bottom, it'll just be 2 times 59 times 84. Okay, so just make sure you put this in correctly. Use the fraction button on your calculator, and it should do the rest for you. And you should get about 73.6 degrees. That's just rounded to 1 decimal place. So it's harder to check our answer here, but we know that x should be the largest angle of the triangle because it's opposite the longest side of 88. So 74 could be the largest angle. If we got something like 50 degrees, there's no way it could be the largest angle, but this is in keeping with what we know. So, of course, we can only use the cosine rule to find an angle when I know all three sides. You can see A, B, and C appear in the calculations, and it's just using a formula. So now we're just going to look at using the cosine rule to solve a problem that we weren't able to do when we were just limiting ourselves to right-angled trigonometry. So let's look at this example here. Andrew and James both fly their planes from the same spot. They start from Canberra. Andrew flies his for 180 kilometers on a 160 degree bearing. James flies his for 200 kilometers on a 220 degree bearing. We're going to find how far apart Andrew and James are. So we've done heaps of bearing questions in right-angled triangles. So as we would if this was a right-angled triangle, we're going to draw a diagram. So start with our little compass. So Andrew has gone on a bearing of 160 degrees. So remember, the bearing is always measured from the north axis in a clockwise direction. So Andrew has gone in this direction. This angle's 160 degrees, so we have our angle 20 degrees. Remember, 180 degrees is due south. So this, we're told, is 180 kilometers. James starts from this same point. He goes for 200 kilometers on a bearing of 220. So 180 is due south, 270 due west, so he's going to be over here somewhere. And this angle here will have to be 40, because 180 plus 40 is 220. And as we see, he's gone for 220 kilometers. So we're going to make this into a triangle, but it's not a right-angled triangle. So we would not have been able to solve this problem if we didn't know the cosine rule. So after we've drawn the diagram, all the work is done. Because we have a triangle, we want to find this distance here, x. We have two sides and the angle between, so this whole angle here will be 60 degrees. Let's just use the cosine rule. So if you've forgotten the formula for finding a side, I'll just write it here. C squared equals A squared plus B squared minus 2AB cos C. It is a long formula to remember, so try and remember Pythagoras minus a little bit. Let's use that for our triangle here. So our C squared is equal to A squared plus B squared minus 2A times B times cos C. And of course C, the angle here, is 60 degrees. So we put this on our calculator. Remember, this tells us x squared. So if you put that in your calculator, you get a nice round number here, which is 41,200, because cos 60 is equal to a half. So then that's x squared. X will be the square root of that. Make sure you remember to square root. A lot of people forget. And then the answer you get is about 202.98. So that means Andrew and James will be about 202.98 kilometers apart. All right, thank you so much for tuning into this video. This has been the luckiest maths teacher in the world. Have a great day.